why is it such a popular modification to do an engine swap, specifically a turbo engine swap on one of these first gen Imprezas. So I think one of the biggest reasons is because they actually never sold a turbo 4-cylinder in the first gen Impreza in the United States or anywhere in North America. They sold them in Australia, obviously they sold them in Japan, they sold them in Europe, and they sold pretty much all over the rest of the world. You had a turbo 4-cylinder with the WRX making like 220 horsepower, 230 horsepower, and the STIs making 285 to maybe 320 horsepower. Those are sold all over the world, but in the United States and the rest of North America, all they ever sold was the naturally aspirated motors. And that came in the 2.2 liters and the 2.5 liters for the 2.5 RS. And really, when you look at the naturally aspirated engine versus a turbocharged engine, you're talking about like 100 horsepower difference, which is a huge difference for one of these first gen Imprezas, because these first gen Imprezas are actually really light vehicles. So adding another 100 horsepower, going from like 130 or 140, 150 horsepower to like 250 horsepower is a huge, huge difference when you talk about the power to weight ratio or the power to mass ratio, which is really good for these first gen Imprezas when you have a turbo power plant. These first gen Imprezas typically weigh anywhere from like 2,700 to 2,800 pounds. And if you lighten up a little bit, you might get them down to 2,600, 25,500. And of course the coupes are even lighter than the 4-doors or the hatchbacks. So that's one of the biggest reasons, is getting that extra horsepower and getting that power to weight ratio into that sweet spot where you're actually getting, something like 250 horsepower to a 2,800 pound, 2,700 pound vehicle. When you add that kind of horsepower to that light of a vehicle, and actually the short wheelbase that these Subaru Imprezas have, they're a relatively small, compact vehicle. So you add the horsepower to a short wheelbase, light vehicle, and then of course you add the all-wheel drive power. These become one of the best performing, most nimble sports cars of the 90s. And that's another reason why, is because a lot of people have this affinity, myself included, for the analog feel of cars from the 90s and early 2000s. I think everybody would agree that as cars got more advanced and more technology was implemented on these vehicles, things like traction control and a bunch of steering aids and a bunch of other factors like drive-by-wire, the more technology that they added to these vehicles to make them drive smoother, maybe accelerate quicker, you actually lost a lot of the driver sensation, a lot of the feel of the road and the road handling that kind of transmitted into the steering wheel, into the driver's seat and driver's experience. So that's a big reason why a lot of people who own these first gen Imprezas really want to keep the first gen Imprezas, not go to one of the later generations, especially the newest ones. The newest ones, you feel like it's just totally insulated from the road. It feels like every other big heavy sports car out there. So there's really nothing like having a light analog feeling sports car. That's why the Porsches were so popular for so many years. I think that's one reason why all these Japanese JDM cars that had big horsepower are so popular from the 90s and early 2000s. And frankly, I prefer having a car that feels much more analog and gives you that like driver sensation that you only get with one of these 90s, early 2000s Subarus, or any really manufactured car. So that's a big reason, is the analog feel you get from these first gen Imprezas, and the need or the requirement to have a turbo motor if you want to get that power to weight ratio. And then one of the other things I mentioned briefly, and I'll kind of expand on it right now, is the all-wheel drive system. When you have 250 horsepower or more, maybe 300, and of course if you do a big turbo, bigger injectors, you do a Pro Tune on a car, these Subarus can have anywhere from 450 to 500 horsepower or more easily, very easily. I know guys that have been driving these Subarus with 600-700 horsepower, 800 horsepower. Of course, if you guys get one of these IAG blocks and you go a full build, you can have a car that has 1,000 horsepower, which is insane. I mean, you're talking supercar range. Get a car with 2,600 pounds, 800 to 1,000 horsepower, all-wheel drive. You're talking supercar category, epic supercar category. But let's bring it back a step here, because most of us aren't talking about 1,000 horsepower all billet block from IAG. That gets really expensive really fast. You start making that much horsepower and everything needs to get beefed up. The axles need to be beefed up, the transmission needs to be beefed up, the differential needs to be beefed up, everything needs to be beefed up when you get into that high horsepower range. So really expensive, really fast. So let's bring it back a notch and talk about just kind of the standard, you know, OEM kind of power levels you'd have with a turbo supercharged, with a turboed 4-cylinder car, which is in the range of like 250 to 300 horsepower. Of course, you could add an aftermarket muffler, a high flow exhaust, a high flow air intake, and you know, maybe even a little bit bigger turbo and bigger injectors, have it pro-tuned, and then you're easily at like 350, 380 horsepower, maybe even 400 horsepower. And 400 horsepower in a 2,700 pound car, all-wheel drive, is legit. Okay, so that's the other thing I was talking about, is the all-wheel drive system. It really, the feeling and the kind of nimble feel of a performance sports car with an all-wheel drive system, you really don't get to feel or take advantage of when you have, you know, a naturally aspirated motor making like 165 horsepower. It just doesn't get you there. So, you know, if you want to enjoy the performance and the driver's experience of having an all-wheel drive car, you really need to get up into a turbocharged 4-cylinder and push into that 230, 250 horsepower range, which is what I'm doing with my EJ207 right now. As you guys can hear, this is not a naturally aspirated motor. This, my friends, is a EJ207 that spins up to probably 7,500, 8,000 RPMs. Hold on, I gotta shift in. And I'm like trying to shift with one hand and hold the camera and do all the shit at the same time. So, getting back to the main focus of this video, why do people want to do a turbo conversion for the first-gen Impreza? Well, like I said, let's recap. They didn't offer a turbo engine in the North American cars, and the only way to have a first-gen Impreza with a turbo motor to get that ideal power-to-weight ratio and take advantage of the all-wheel drive system is to add a turbocharged car. And the last thing I'll just mention is that, you know, the first-gen Imprezas, by many people's opinion, are just the best-looking Subarus ever built. I'm sorry, they just are. I mean, not only were they used in World Rallycross and Colin McRae and all the winning WRC events were done in these like 90s Subaru Imprezas, you know, which is kind of like the legacy of these cars as a sports car and as a rallycross car and autocross car, and kind of the motorsports heritage that these cars have. But let's just be honest, guys. Subaru nailed the design of these cars for the first-gen Imprezas. I mean, I'm sorry, the Blob Eyes are cool, the Hawk Eyes are cool, you know, the newer ones look okay, but honestly, nothing looks like a first-gen Impreza, especially the coupe, especially with the big fog light bumpers, the facelift grille, the hood vents, maybe even the WRC hood vents that have the little scoops on them, the big, you know, spoiler, and all the different types of spoiler options you guys had. Let's just be honest, guys. None of the other Imprezas ever made after 2001 came anywhere near the design and just the purity and just the fucking awesome just kind of looks of the first-gen Imprezas. So if you want to stick in the first-gen Impreza and you're in North America, specifically in the United States, you know, you don't want to upgrade to a Blob Eye or a Bug Eye or any of these other Subarus that came with a turbo plant. You don't. You want to stick with the first-gen Impreza because they are epic looking, and there's nothing that replaces the looks and aesthetics and the design of these first-gen Imprezas. So if you want to keep your first-gen Impreza and actually have a fun experience driving a car that has a good power-to-weight ratio, then you got to do a turbo power plant. I'm sorry, that's just the only way to do it. And also, you get the power-to-weight ratio is better with these first-gen Imprezas. I mentioned that earlier as a power-to-weight ratio, but when you go into a Blob Eye and the Hawk Eyes and the Bug Eyes, all the Impreza generations that came after this first-gen Impreza got heavier and heavier and heavier. And as a car gets heavier, everything about that driving experience gets compromised. Obviously, the acceleration slows down, but also the center of gravity and the kind of suspension characteristics and the driving characteristics, the braking ability changes. Everything changes when you add a lot of weight. And honestly, I think the new Subaru Imprezas are like in the high 3,000s. I think they're like 3,700 pounds. Maybe they're 3,400 and change, but I mean, that's almost 800, 900 pounds heavier than a first-gen Impreza. And I actually read an article, like many years ago, that basically said every 100 pounds is equivalent to 10 horsepower as far as the drivability and the acceleration and performance of the car. So if you add 1,000 pounds to a car, you're essentially taking away 100 horsepower from the engine, or from the performance characteristics of the car's drivability. It's equivalent to having 100 horsepower less on the engine if you add 1,000 pounds in weight to the vehicle. So that's always been my kind of like rule of thumb, is that, you know, I know that every 100 pounds that I add to a vehicle, I'm basically taking away 10 horsepower from the engine. And I gotta be honest with you guys, it's a lot more expensive to add horsepower to an engine than it is to reduce weight on a chassis and on the vehicle. It's a good general approach to think about when you're interested in making your car have a better driving experience and improve the drivability of your car. Is it's almost never cheaper to, you know, try to make more horsepower from your engine. It's almost always more cost effective to try to lose the weight to add the equivalent power to the engine. And it also improves, like I said, the suspension, the braking, the center of gravity around turns, and a lot of other characteristics of the driving experience. So if you have a choice between adding horsepower or taking weight away, I suggest you focus on weight reduction. That's definitely a better approach to go. Okay, so basically we've kind of talked about a couple different categories here. The fact that they didn't offer it in North America and they offered it in every other region in the world. Japan, Australia, EU, all over Europe. Like basically, I don't know what the hell Subaru was thinking, hosing North America and the US market in the 90s and not providing a turbo engine for these cars. Jesus Christ. So that's the biggest reason. The power to weight ratio, keeping the aesthetics of that first gen Impreza, which is pretty much the best looking Subaru that Subaru ever made in these first gen Imprezas, in my opinion. I guess that's subjective. And of course, the drivability and the power to weight ratio. So I'm going to wrap it up there for today, guys. That's my reason why the turbo engine swap is such a popular upgrade to do for these first-gen Imprezas. There's a bunch of reasons. They're all legitimate, and it's really what drove my decision and my journey building this car over the last, 7+ years of my 1998 2.5 RS coupe that has a World Rally Blue. So that about wraps up for today, guys. Thanks so much for checking out the video. I really appreciate it. My name's Luke. You guys are watching the Subaru Only Show. Until next time, guys. Later.